We are not moving on to Rome, actually. We're moving midways to Sicily, as I'm gonna show in a moment. And so I'm gonna talk to you about Aeneid 5. That is the book in the Aeneid about the games. So we're not just gonna talk about the games. I don't know if any of you has read Aeneid 5. Can I get a show of hands if you have? Okay, good portion. It normally has a bit of a bad press as a boring book. Nothing really happens in terms of or little happens in terms of the narrative of the story. But it also has some amazing press as one of the most elegant, in a way, symmetrical book, and as I hope I'm going to show you a little bit, a microcosm for the whole poem. So we are kind of in the middle of the Aeneid. It is a book of stole, so I'm gonna just remind you of the timeline of the Aeneid. So when the Aeneid starts, actually, we meet. We meet Aeneas and the Trojans as they're sailing off from Sicily into Italy. They basically arrived right at the beginning of the Aeneid. And then Juno sends a storm that sends them off route to the city of Carthage, right in Tunisia. And we find out about what happened in Sicily in Book 3, in the words of Aeneas himself. And at the end of Book 3, we find out that Anchises, Aeneas' father, has died. And that's how Book 3 ends. And then we get Book 4, that perhaps some of you are more familiar with. That's the Dido book, this tragedy of Dido. And after Aeneas abandons Dido, he sails back to Italy, but he stops again in Sicily. So it's a book, in a sense there is a repetition here. He stops there again, as you can see. Exactly 1 year after the death of his father to sacrifice at the tomb of his father and to hold his games in honor of Anchises before they continue to Italy. First to Cuma, so Book 6 is another probably more famous book. It's the Underworld Book, where he actually meets Anchises as a ghost. And then off to Latium to wage war against the Italians. So it's a book of stole. In a sense, it's a book of repetition. And it's a book, it's not exactly in the middle, obviously, of the poem. But it seems like the middle path or the middle way is a really big concern of this book. The Latin word medius, recurs a lot in this book throughout, and at the very beginning of the book we hear that Aeneas is keeping an iter medium. He's in the middle of his journey. It's also in the middle, this kind of contributes to its bad press because it is sandwiched between two very famous books, kind of very emotive books, so books 4 and 6. So it's in the middle of those books as well. And it's a book that complicates, as I'm going to tell you in a moment, the picture of the Aeneid, as you may have been taught, as being kind of half Odyssean and half Iliadic, because there's a lot in this book that is actually more about the Iliad than it is about the Odyssey. I'm going to try and talk about games as well, but the games in themselves bring up a number of themes that are really important for the Aeneid as a whole, and these are just some of the themes that come out in this book. It's a book about generations passing. At the beginning of the book, Aeneas kind of properly takes over from Anchises. He's presented at the beginning of the book as certain, sorry, I'm just going back, certus. He's certain, this probably Shanice Bart's translation that I used, without slackening in his resolve. So it's as if he has grown. It's a book that is very important for Aeneas's characterization. And we get a sense of different generations. We also get, especially at the end of the games, there is this parade of the youth of the Trojans, led by Ascanius. So there is a sense that Aeneas himself is in the middle between these two generations, his father and his son. It's a book that's obviously concerned with parenthood. These are the funeral games in honor of the father. So it's a book that's important for piety, pietas, that, if you study the Aeneid, you will know it's kind of one of the most important traits of the poem and of Aeneas as a hero. But it's not just the figure of the father, both Anchises and Aeneas as a father, that comes out here. It's also a book about mothers, but it's a book about mothers much more silently, in a sense, because the book is set in Sicily, as I'll show you, near the temple for Venus Erycina, and Venus is the mother of Aeneas, and there is a sense throughout the book that she is the one who is favoring the journey. There is also a really nice line of the bones of Anchises that are encompassed, kind of encircled by this earth in a sort of maternal embrace, but also a sort of almost sexual embrace between Venus as a deity and Anchises as a mortal. So there is a kind of an overarching sense of, male parenthood, but there is also this theme of maternal protection throughout the book. And it's a book that the games are very much, say, about masculinity, testing masculinity, the limits of it, training it for the upcoming wars as well. And again, much more silently perhaps, but also in a kind of almost explosive way. It's a book about femininity as well, and I will show you this at the end, hopefully, at the end of this talk. Because as you can see from the picture that I showed here, on the one hand, the men are engaged in the games. Here you can see the archery contest. On the other hand, the women in the background are setting their ships on fire because they want to stay in this land. So it's very much, it's a very interesting book for questions of gender and parenthood in the poem. It's a book that's supposedly about games. Together with the word medius, the word laetus appears a lot in this book. It's a happy book. Everyone is happy. They're doing games for fun. But there is this sense, as I said, that these games are a training for war, and there are echoes of the tragedies that will happen in the second half of the poem as well. And I'm going to show you some of this. But there is also a sense, well, we kind of can tell that the book also includes a number of hints at actual conflicts, both from Virgil's more contemporary history and from the past history. It's a book that's set in Sicily, that was the site of the wars against Carthage, and it opens with Carthage on fire, so Aeneas kind of looking back at the fires of the city. So the Punic Wars are a big concern of this book. And it's also a book that's set on the islands that was the theatre of the war against Sextus Pompeius in the recent civil war. So these two wars are in the background of Virgil's mind, and they should be in the background of his readers as well. It's a book about foundations and war are kind of connected to each other, because I'll show you where we are. So we are in what will become then the Punic side of Sicily. We are at Mount Eryx. I'll show you a picture soon. Sorry, I can't really, but it's on the the western side near Taranto. You probably can't see anything from here, but you can see it from this big. That is where Eryx is. After the women set fire to the ships, a city will be founded called Segesta, and this city is the city that asked for help during the First Punic War to the Romans against the Carthaginians on the basis of their shared ancestry. So it's a book that retrospectively makes this claim true, that the Romans are never the ones who start wars. They're always like helping out allies. Segesta in the First Punic War and a city called Saguntum in the Second Punic War. So it kind of creates the background story for that. It's a book about identity as well, because, as I said, it's a book of transition. The Trojans start to become something different. The Sicilians are mixed identities as well. They're partly Trojans themselves. They're partly local, and the Trojans, if you've read the Aeneid, you will know, they would kind of lose their Trojan identity at the end of the poem, and they're kind of going forward, like going towards this to find their new identity, sort of proto-Romans. Okay, so it's a book about loss, as I will show you. So on the surface, it's glittering and happy, but there's a lot of tragedy lurking in the background as well. History, and especially military history, and what is called axiology. So Segesta is one example. So the origins of things, in this case, the origin of the city. But also the origin of rights, and especially the parentalia, as the rites that were performed in Roman times are kind of given a little bit of a history here, and also the origins, as I will show you, of some Roman families. I mean, the whole of the Aeneid is about theology anywhere, but the whole of the Aeneid is about all of these things. So it's really interesting to look in Aeneid 5 how they all interact and how the games kind of bring them out. Okay, so this is Sicily. Eryx, as I told you, which is here. This is what you do. I don't know if anyone has been. Yeah, it's an amazing place. So the games are there at the foot. It's mounted, it always has, not in this picture, but it always has a cloud on top. So even like on the brightest day, you will go up there and it will be cloudy. And I mean, it's a really incredible place, and you can tell why kind of it was a place of worship. Probably, since antiquity. The temple of Venus, or so-called Venus Erycina, is, you can still visit it today, and it's built upon the foundation of a temple to Tanit, as a Punic divinity. And this is the temple, and it kind of overlooks all the surroundings. This place, or these shores, are called fraterna, kind of brotherly shores, because Eryx himself is from whom the mountain takes the name, is brother, is also the son of Aphrodite, so brother to Aeneas. Eryx himself does not appear as a character, but his gloves play a big part in the wrestling match, and there's an incredible description of what these gloves look like, how heavy they are as they're taken up by Entellus, and that's another case of kind of talking about generation and sort of bringing, on your shoulder the burden of your fathers, for better or worse. So this is the structure. As I said, it has been noted to be like the best structured book in the Aeneid. It's very carefully structured. It has what is called a ring composition of kind of two sacrifices. There are two deaths framing this book. One is the death of Dido, so it starts with the Trojans looking at these flames from Carthage, and it ends with the death of Palinurus, was going to be a sacrifice, like one person sacrificed for all, and that's a big message kind of in the Aeneid, of the sacrifice of the individual for the community. Also, kind of in ring composition, there are two voyages, right? So voyage from Libya to Sicily, and then from Sicily to Italy. There is also like a mini storm at the beginning of the book. And then we have four matches: the boat race, the foot rower, also called the regatta, the foot race, the boxing match, and the archery contest. And these are also very carefully structured. So two of them are long. The boat race and the boxing match are quite long episodes, whereas the foot race and the archery contest are short. And they're kind of really matching themselves. And they are topped by this parade of Trojan youth called the Lusus Troiae. And then we have this kind of afterthought of these women exploding and burning the ships. Women were defined as mothers, the Trojan mothers, who decide that they've had enough and they want to stay there. And they burn exactly 4 ships, which is exactly the number of the ships that compete in the boat race. So we have like this, as I said, this is sort of almost kind of opposites. Light and dark, happiness and sadness, growth and loss, and also gender can be explored, I guess, according to these opposites as well. So these are the four matches that we find. As I said, first we have the boat race. And we're going to look at that in a little bit of detail. That is followed, that is a very long episode, it's followed by the foot race, and then we have the wrestling, that's a short episode, the wrestling match is another long episode, and then the archery contest, that is pretty short as well. I was hoping that David would talk about these models, but he wants to do something else, and it's really fascinating anyway. But I'm not going to talk about these, but there are 2 main models for Virgil's games. The one that is kind of mostly recognized are the games, the funeral games for Patroclus in Iliad 23. But there are also many reasons why we may think of Virgil's games as indebted to a much shorter episode that is found in Odyssey 8 at the court of the Phaeacians, the games at the court of Alcinous. The boxing match also has memories of Apollonius of Rhodius. And the fact that these 2 models coexist is kind of problematic, as I mentioned before, for this idea of the Aeneid that we sometimes have as like half Odyssean and half Iliadic, because there's lots of Iliad in this book, in what is supposed to be the Odyssean part. And the theme of parenthood, kind of competition with your father, is a theme that runs throughout the book, also in a metapoetic sense, as in Virgil competing with Homer, but also competing with Ennius in a different way, because Ennius wrote about the Punic Wars instead, and Naevius as well. But in terms of kind of his sort of games model, kind of competing with Homer, and it's really interesting in showing how he's doing. So basically, he chooses to change. So obviously the Iliad didn't have a boat race. It had a chariot race, and within the boat race, the regatta, Virgil tells you that in a simile, in a kind of extended simile, and the book is actually full of these similes that are really interesting, I think. It tells you that this is a kind of poetic race, that his regatta is much better than a chariot race. So he says that not even speeding chariots springing from their stalls devour racetracks with such speed. And he's telling you, my boats are faster, and this poem is better. And he's giving you something kind of very different. And it is, in a sense, giving you something very different because there are lots of anachronisms in this poem that make us think about contemporary Augustan Rome. The boat race, in particular, Augustus himself, in his testament, the Res Gestae, says that he gave to the people a spectacle of a sea battle on the other side of the Tiber, which must have been an incredible spectacle at the time. 30 ships with rams and many smaller boats did battle. In this fleet fought about 3,000 men, discounting the rowers. We may not want to take him face value, but it still must have been an incredible spectacle in an especially excavated arena by the Tiber. It was something incredibly grand. And so clearly there is a sense, I think, of the regatta matching somehow these plans, just like when Virgil is talking about so this is the beginning of the foot race. He uses the word circus. There was a circle all around stood wooded hills, and in the middle of the valley, another middle, there was a circle for a theatre. We may think of an anachronistic word. We may be reminded of the games in the Circus Maximus as well. So there are these continuous anachronisms in the book, and maybe one of the bigger things that we are meant to hear in terms of fathers, especially, is a parallel between Augustus sacrificing at the tomb of Anchises. Aeneas. That's I got it. Aeneas is sacrificing at the tomb of Anchises, where we have this incredible picture of here is a giant serpent coming to eat the libations, which is strangely interpreted as a good omen, and the funerals for Caesar, and the kind of praise speeches at that funeral. And similarly, the archery contest ends with Acestes, with the guest, the host to the Trojans, who it's his time to shoot the arrow, but the dove that he was meant to shoot has already been killed. So he's there is nothing that he can do, but he shoots the arrow anyway, and the arrow takes flame like a comet. And again, the comet, this is it has been interpreted as a portent. So we're told in the poem that this is like a portent, and it's clearly connected to the comet that was seen after the death of Caesar. And you can see it also on some of the coins of Augustus that also has the, in memory, Divus Iulius, so the comet was a symbol for Caesar. So this is probably the epitome of this Roman parallel, historical parallel. Okay, so I just wanted to talk to you about three themes that problematize this sort of happy picture of Book 5. Maybe some of you who have studied the Aeneid have been introduced to the idea of farther voices in the Aeneid, so that the Aeneid, on the one hand, can be interpreted as this poem that praises the Romans and Augustus and Aeneas' enterprise, and on the other hand includes these voices of loss and tragedy. And this is something that is very much epitomized in Aeneid 5. And these are not I just wanted to show you some of the ways, some of the episodes that show you this sort of more problematic, dark aspects of this book. So the first thing is that there are monsters in the boat race, or that the very ships of the boat race are strangely called with names of monsters. So in the regatta we have 4 ships. I told you that there is a sense of etiology of Roman families. So we have, and Virgil tells us explicitly, a guy called Nestus, who is the ancestor of the Memmi, Gaius, who commentators tell us is the ancestor of the Gegani, then people say, why did actually Virgil choose some, not necessarily the most well-known aristocratic families of the time? That's another matter. Sergestus, as I'm going to talk a little bit about, is the ancestor of the Sergi. Cloanthus is the ancestor of the Cluenti. And these men are on ships that are called the Priestis. That was some kind of monster. We don't really know what it looked like. Chalibarge translates it as the Kraken. That's actually a more contemporary monster. Gaius runs the Chimaera, Sergestus the Centaurus, and Cloanthus the Scylla. This is what the Kraken obviously is kind of an anachronistic addition for the Priestis, but these are kind of like the monsters that these ships were going to elicit. So there is something horrifying about these ships. There is a sense, in any case, in antiquity, throughout antiquity, there's a sense that navigation is hubristic. It's something that somehow, is not meant to happen, like taking trees from the mountains and putting them in the water in a different shape. This is a theme that kind of runs throughout the Aeneid. There is something that violates the forces of nature. But there is also a sense that we may kind of hear overtones of like contemporary battles and especially civil war. The Centaurus in particular is generally believed to evoke the centaurs that were probably appeared at the prow of the ships of Antony's fleet at the Battle of Actium. We know this from Propertius, but we also know this from this incredible Actian relief that has survived and which shows the Battle of Actium, and we can find centaurs, threatening centaurs on the prow of the ships, so obviously Propertius, centaurs threatening to throw rocks. And Sergestus, as I said, as the ancestor of the Sergi, is also kind of a threatening figure. So as the ancestor of the Sergi is the ancestors of Catilina, so he's the ancestor of a rebellious character from contemporary history and kind of sort of, social, civil war in a sense, kind of before its time. And he is related to Catilina also in the poem itself. So what happens, Sergestus is kind of a hubristic man. He succumbs to lunacy, and he has to, so basically in the regatta there is like a middle point, and all the boats have to run around it and then go back, which is another image for the chariot race in a sense. The middle point is a rock, and Sergestus goes too close to the rock, trying to take less time, right? And that just means that his boat crashes onto the rocks, goes into the shore. And we find on the shield of Aeneas Catiline also hanging from a threatening cliff. So there clearly is some sort of connection between these two characters in the Aeneid. So there are threatening aspects in the boat race, and there are very tragic aspects in the foot race. So the foot race has these two characters, Euryalus and Nisus, that you may know from another book of the Aeneid. They feature extensively in Aeneid 9. They are one of the very few representations of same-sex love in and then kind of very heartfelt at that in Latin literature. And in Book 9, they decide to go to attack the camp of the Rutulians at night, but then they get discovered and slaughtered. And they have a relationship kind of in ancient homoerotic terms of Erastes and Eromenos. So the Erastes is Nisus, is like the older lover, and Euryalus is the younger of the pair. And both in the foot race and in Book 9, we have the picture of Nisus attempting to save Euryalus, and in Book 9 this ends in tragedy and in disaster. And in both cases, he does so. In both cases, there are examples of trickery, a kind of deceit. It's really interesting what happens, I think, in these two books with Virgil's poetry, because these are some of the examples. Maybe some of you who have read the poem in Latin will know that there are some half lines in the poem. There are some lines that Virgil doesn't seem to have finished, and they are called tubicines. You can call them half lines, which is fine. And the general view is that Virgil would have finished the poem if he could, so that these lines had to be filled. This is probably correct because we don't find these in any other hexametric poem in antiquity. But there is also a sense that these are places of big emotional turmoil for Virgil. They appear in difficult places. Sometimes they appear, for instance, in the Cyclops, because he's kind of battling with Homer. He doesn't really know how to write the Cyclops as well as Homer. That is an interpretation that has been put forward. But they appear 3 times between book 5 and 9 when Virgil is talking about Euryalus and Nisus, as if they're kind of stopping almost. So these are the 3: Nisus et Euryalus primi, Euryali et Nisi, Tertius Euryalus. And there seems to be a sense of tragedy underpinning them. There's kind of this stop, this lacuna that we have to feel almost as if you just can't go on writing. So that is how I like to read them. So the first is the first presentation of Nisus and Euryalus, with Euryalus marked by beauty and green youth, and Nisus by, and this has been a really interesting passage in commentators, he's bound by his pious love for the young man. And you can imagine that commentators have made all sorts of things with this pious. Is this, what kind of love is this? Is this a sexual, as pious means that, there is no sexual relationship between the two. Or all sorts of anachronistic interpretations on this. And the other time in book 5 is when Euryalus is the 3rd in the race. So the people competing are Nisus, at this point the first 3, and there are others, Nisus, Silius, and Euryalus. And this, Euryalus was 3rd, and then we have a gap. What happens then is that Nisus falls in a pool of slippery blood from the sacrifices of the bull, so he slips. And then he still remembers his love for Euryalus, so he trips Silius so that Euryalus can win. Euryalus comes first, and he gets the prize of the winner, which is a shining helmet. And this is already a terrible foreboding if you go on and read in Aeneid 9, because the Rutulians find the two because of this shining helmet, which is a different helmet, but it's this shining helmet that Euryalus puts on his head, and from the shine, the Rutulians find out about the 2 boys. And the other thing is that also in book 9, Nisus goes back. Nisus had actually managed to escape from the slaughter, but Euryalus stood back, and so Nisus went back to try and save him, and then he was killed. So in a similar sense here, Nisus is trying to kind of save Euryalus in a kind of humorous setting, but there is this foreboding of the later tragedy. And the episode is kind of coined on an episode of Iliad 23 where Athena causes Ajax to sleep in some dung that Odysseus is able to win. But Virgil has substituted blood from the mud, which again seems to be, you can make whatever you want with this kind of sacrificial blood in the case of, as I said, the upcoming tragedy of these 2 boys. And if you have read book 9, you may also remember the grief of the mother of Euryalus when the 2 heads of the boys um, are brought to the Trojan camp up on spikes, and it's one of the most, I think, striking and really devastating passages of the Aeneid. And that kind of is a foreboding for the grief of all the parents in losing youth, in losing sons in war. In Aeneid 5, we have this phrase that recurs twice, ante ora parentum, before their parents' eyes. The boys in the Lusus Troiae advance in the parade in front of their parents' eyes, and it's a phrase that recalls really terrible moments in the Aeneid. It's used in Aeneid 1 when Aeneas remembers all those who died at Troy under their father's gaze, antora patrum. And in Aeneid 6, again, it's used for sons placed on the pyre before their parents' eyes. So there is a sense, yes, these are games, this is a parade, but there is this this other thing. And as I said, the death of Dido, the sacrifice of Dido, and the sacrifice of Palinurus, one man's sacrifice for everyone, they frame this happy book, as it were. And my very last point with which I wanted to leave you is, the point, the Trojan women, which actually are the Trojan mothers, and the extent to which the grief of Euryalus' mother, as we will know it in Aeneid 9, is present here in the grief of, and kind of strength also of these mothers as they set fire to the ships and they say, no more, we're gonna stay here with the youngest children. And they do, they are successful. And there is a sense of complete separation between the men and the women. The women are secretae on, it's not here, I didn't include it, but anyway, they are said to be secretae. They are divided from the men on an empty beach. So we have the sense of separation throughout. The different things are going on between them, and they are crying about the fact that so much more is going to come, and they're crying with one voice for all, with a single voice, says Virgil. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote, because this vox omnibus una, one single voice for all the women, has been an important point in feminist. There isn't much feminist criticism of the Aeneid, to be honest, but where there are two important articles by Georgia Nugent, and kind of they're sort of related to one another and they focus a lot about this voice of the women, not just the women of Aeneid 5, but in this case the women of Aeneid 5, and how are we meant to read this voice of the women that is the same for everyone in this male-authored epic. And her answer is that they speak as one, but it is important to realize, she writes, that no woman ever speaks in this voice, and no man ever hears it. So she says that the women as a collective are used as a bearer of meaning, just as an empty space to be filled by, you can add, male authorial desire and designed. And so viewed in this way, this alleged collective voice of women in Aeneid 5, it's not some sort of sisterhood, but it's a particularly useful kind of silence on behalf of the poet's manipulation. So I'm just going to leave you with this. This is something that you can think about. To what extent is this Virgil ventriloquizing the voices of all women speaking the same? Or to what extent actually there is something in the Aeneid that we can recuperate of these women's voices, of their desires, and of their desires aligning with these farther voices of the Aeneid that go against, this overarching happy plan. Virgil could also have not included them at all. So I'm going to stop here. I hope this will,
Okay. We should have time for one question. again, if you could do, I'm sorry to be a cracked record here, get your feedback done, and especially if you've got to go soon afterwards, get the feedback done, and then either leave it on your desks or just collect them at the back, but wherever, as long as you leave them, that'll be fine. So, any questions?
I saw a few questions.
Okay, so we try.
Can you speak out a bit?
During the game, how does the check, like, what activities they do to act as war, and how is, like, the Trojan change their identity as part of the competition?
So what is deployed in terms of kind of training for war? Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, mostly I think that comes out in the Lusus Troiae. There is a sense of this voice kind of growing and in kind of preparation almost for the upcoming wars, I suppose. And then I think I gave you like Aurelius and Nisus as one example of an episode that that will actually, you know, re-echo the upcoming war in Italy as well. But there are actually echoes throughout. It's generally thought to be the book is thought to be paired with Aeneid 11, which is another important book for kind of fathers and sons. So if you start to read them together, I think they kind of make for a bit of a troubling pair. In terms of the Trojans' identity, they kind of, you know, they remain Trojans in a sense, obviously. But in part of the Trojans, obviously, the women, weak old men, the children remain there in Sicily. They mingle with some. The Sicilians also participate in the game. The Sicilians themselves seem to be, Sicily in itself as a place of middle is a place of kind of mixing and miscegenation. So in a sense, you get a sense, I think, of Sicily as a mini Rome, or what will be in Italy. And I think there's kind of all these Roman, more anachronistic Roman rituals, the parentalia especially, but also kind of this, you know, these anachronisms towards Roman history set Aeneas closer to the, you know, to kind of Virgil's contemporary Romans than he probably was like in Aeneid 4, because in Aeneid 4 at some points he's described as still very orientalized, especially by Iarbas, but also when Mercury comes and he sees him like wearing this sort of oriental cloak. So there is this sense that he has left all of that behind. He's sort of already, there are problems about Troy as kind of a paradigm of luxury. So they're kind of abandoning that a little bit, if it makes sense.
Great, I think we better leave it there. So thank you very much, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you.